So thank you. This presentation is about open source licenses. Don't let the clickbait fool you. My name is Ido Tuchman, and I'm an attorney here in San Diego. I've been a lawyer for about 20 years, and my legal practice is focused on intellectual property law. So things like copyrights, trademarks, and patents. And since this talk is about the law, I'm obligated by the California Bar Association to give you a standard legal disclaimer. So bear with me here. First, this presentation is about legal issues and may cause drowsiness. Don't operate a motor vehicle or other heavy equipment during this presentation. And second, this presentation is only informational and is not intended as legal advice. You should consult with a legal professional about your particular situation. Okay, so with that out of the way, I want to tell you about one of my cases. A few years ago, one of my clients, a software company, hired me to respond to a cease and desist letter. Now, if you don't know what a cease and desist letter, it's a lawyer's way of saying, knock it off or I'm going to sue you. If you ever get a cease and desist letter from a lawyer, don't ignore it. Now, in this particular case, the letter basically said, stop copying our software. But the situation was unusual for two reasons. First, the letter was not addressed to my client. It was addressed to an open source project. And second, the letter was written on behalf of another open source project. So basically, one open source project, let's call them Project Left, hired a law firm to send a cease and desist letter to another open source project, let's call them Project Right. And my client, who's not named in the cease and desist letter, was giving me a bag of money to respond to the cease and desist letter on behalf of Project Right. So you might first be wondering, why would my client pay a lawyer to respond to a cease and desist letter that's not addressed to them? Well, the client was a sponsor and user of Project Right. So if Project Left was successful in shutting down Project Right, my client would lose money and would have to redevelop their product and risk getting sued by Project Left. And you might also be wondering, why would one open source project care if another open source project is using their code? I mean, they're both open source projects. Well, the problem was that Project Left was licensed under the GNU public license, the GPL, while Project Right was licensed under the MIT license. So to understand why that matters, let's quickly talk about US copyright law. And we'll start with the US Constitution. So Article 1, Section 8 of the US Constitution gives Congress the power to promote the progress of science and useful arts by granting exclusive rights to authors for their works. So this is the reasoning behind copyright law. Society's body of knowledge grows when creators share their works. In order to promote society's knowledge, we're going to reward the creators the exclusive right to exploit their work for a limited time. Now, under copyright law, whenever you create an original creative work, you automatically receive a copyright to that work, whether you ask for it or not. Copyright law gives authors the exclusive rights to reproduce their work, modify their work, distribute copies of their work, and display their work publicly. And computer code is considered a literary work under the copyright law and gives software developers the exclusive right to copy, modify, distribute both their source code and object code. Now, a copyright license is a contract that permits a non-owner of a copyrighted work to copy, modify, or distribute the work under certain conditions. In other words, a copyright license sets terms and conditions for what a licensee can and cannot do with copyrighted material. So traditional software licenses are all about clamping down access to the code. If possible, only object code or minified code is provided to the end user. And traditional licenses typically prohibit software users from republishing the software, modifying the code. They'll restrict the number of installations or users allowed to run the code, and they'll limit the software provider's liability. Some licenses only allow personal use and not commercial use of the software. So some developers believe that copyright law fails to strike the correct balance between the rights of the software owners and the rights of the software users. they said, wait a minute, software is utilitarian in nature and not expressive. By allowing software owners to hide their source code, the copyright system gives the owners all the benefits of exclusive control without society receiving any knowledge in return. So they're like, whatever happened to the promoting the progress of science and useful arts? So these developers, they stood on their workstation, they raised their cans of Jolt Cola high in the air, and they screamed revolution, and they hacked the copyright system. They created open source licenses that permitted free usage, modification, and publication of software. And most importantly, these licenses required access to the source code. Now, there's a broad spectrum of open source licenses, ranging from simply releasing the code to the public without restrictions to very protective licenses that seek to maximize free access to source code. Protective licenses, sometimes called copyleft or strict licenses, are those open source licenses that require reciprocal licensing of modified source code. The most popular protective license is the General Public License, or GPL. Now, the GPL lets you use, publish, sell, and modify GPL software. These rights terminate if you fail to comply with other terms of the GPL. And released GPL software, whether it's modified or unmodified, must be licensed under the GPL, and the GPL must be shown, the license text itself. So in other words, you can't release GPL software unmodified or modified as proprietary software. And furthermore, the modified software must state it is a modified version of the original. Now, released means distributing the software outside of your company or organization. Transferring software between employees or for purposes of modifying a private copy doesn't constitute a release. But if you do release GPL software, whether it's modified or unmodified, you must also publish the source code. And the GPL excludes software from laws preventing circumvention of digital rights management. So you can modify GPL software by adding your own DRM, but you can't sue someone from circumventing your DRM. Now, GPL software can be trademarked. Trademarks protect consumers from confusingly similar products and services. So for example, Debian and Ubuntu, which are GPL software, have trademarked their names and logos to protect their reputation and ecosystem. You can freely distribute modified Debian code, but you can't call it Debian. Now, the GPL has a SAS loophole. Remember that when you release your GPL code, the release only happens when software leaves the company. So if a company modifies GPL code to run as a network service and never distributes it outside its doors, it can keep its code proprietary and never release the source code. So if a company like MongoDB offers a database as a network service, open sourcing under a copyleft license doesn't make much sense to them, because competitors could just modify MongoDB's published code, create a competing service, and never have to release their source code for their modified code. So to address the SAS loophole, open source advocates created even stronger licenses. These licenses require open sourcing code that is publicly accessible on a network server. So these type of strict open source licenses corrected many of the problems that open source advocates perceived. Software under these licenses gave users the freedom to run, copy, distribute, study, change, and improve the software. However, some people thought the licenses went too far in some situations. For example, developers wanted to use open source libraries. Hang on, I got a phone call. So if you wanted to use open source libraries to keep your source code proprietary, you didn't have that option. You'd have to open source all of your code in order to bring in that open source library. So this created a problem because open source advocates wanted their source code, their libraries, to be industry standards, but this type of license prevented open source libraries from being adopted, and it created opportunities for proprietary software libraries to become industry standards. So in response, weakly protective licenses were created to allow proprietary software to coexist with open source libraries. So under these libraries, under these licenses, code that merely uses open source libraries can remain closed source. However, code that is based on open source libraries must be released as open source. And the distinction between uses and based on is sometimes difficult to define. If your code modifies an open source library, then it's considered a based on work and must be released as open source. But code that dynamically links to libraries can stay proprietary. But when you have statically linked libraries, that can cause code to fall under the based on definition, and the source code may need to be released. So this may require configuring any code bundlers that you have to bundle open source libraries in separate files from proprietary code. But then again, some people disagree with that. But you know what, in reality, some developers are just not that interested in ensuring that the modified code is made available to everyone to use and study and modify. They don't want to like try and figure out if the code uses or is based on other code. They basically want people to maximize the benefit of their software. So permissive licenses let anyone take the source code and do whatever they want with it. Developers can modify the source code, keep it for themselves, even sell the resulting work as proprietary software without contributing anything back. So often permissive licenses require nothing more than the original copyright notice and maybe an attribution. Permissive licenses don't fully embrace the goals of protective licenses. They don't require everyone to share improvements to open source code. While developers may still do so under the permissive licenses, there's no legal obligation to do so. However, permissive licenses make open source adoption much easier. Permissive licenses typically don't conflict with either protective licenses or proprietary licenses. Permissive license projects are more likely to be commercially sponsored. So in that case, like companies can doubly benefit by sponsoring permissive licensed projects. A sponsor can create goodwill by helping produce code for the common good while retaining the ability to use resulting code in their own proprietary projects. So there's many terms and conditions that are common to both protective and permissive licenses. Like proprietary software licenses, many open source licenses disclaim warranties, liabilities for damage, and software support. Some open source licenses require licensing of any contributor-owned patents that would be infringed by the software. And open source licenses may include a patent retaliation clause. And that clause basically is triggered when if you're instituting a patent litigation against someone using the software, then that causes the open source license to be revoked for you. And some licenses require modified software to credit the original author. Other licenses prohibit using the original author's name to endorse or promote modified code. So returning back to that spectrum of open source licenses, we can broadly summarize the different types of open source licenses. In general, all licenses require attribution and a license notice. On the right side of the spectrum are the permissive licenses. These are the licenses that take a hands-off approach and allow code modifications to be proprietary and closed source. there's no reciprocal license required. Now, on the left side are the protective licenses. And these licenses require reciprocal licensing for modifications to open source code. If you modify source code under a protective license, your modification is also under a protective license and must be made available to users. We have weakly protective licenses that exempt proprietary code that merely uses open source libraries. And then we have strongly protective licenses that require open source code accessed over a network to be made available under a reciprocal license. Now, there's no correct open source license to use. Different open source licenses reflect different philosophies about the public's right to access code, different views about the developer's ability to keep code proprietary, and even different goals for code adoption. However, open source licenses are important because the default rule is that no one can copy and modify software unless they have written permission from the copyright holder. If you found software on GitHub without a license specified, you'd be risking being sued for copyright infringement if you use the code in your project. So software without any license is basically closed source software. So with that summary of open source licenses, let's revisit the cease and desist case. If you recall, we have Project Left was licensed under the GPL, which is a protective open source license. Any modified Project Left code had to be licensed under the GPL. And then Project Right was licensed under the MIT license, which is a permissive license. So Project Left was basically accusing Project Right of relicensing their GPL code as MIT license code. This meant that people could take Project Left's code, modify it, and keep it proprietary. Now, it turned out there were 3 reasons why Project Right had similar code as Project Left. First, some instances, both projects used common code from other libraries that were licensed under the MIT license, and that's fine. Second, in some instances, there was a common contributor to both projects who licensed the contributions to both projects under their respective licenses, and that's perfectly okay. And the third reason, which was by far the most satisfying to point out in the response letter, was that Project Left had actually taken code from Project Right. So I sent a response to the cease and desist letter stating that there was no infringement and pointing out that Project Left actually needed to credit Project Right for Project Right's code. And Project Left didn't bother Project Right again after that. So that's all I have. Here's my contact information again. I'm also on LinkedIn if anybody wants to connect. And if there's time, I'm happy to take questions.
I've got
Please
a question.
ask away if you have any questions.
Yeah. Hi, this is Dan King. Thanks for that great presentation. I'd love to know, David, where we can get a copy of the recording later, because there's some gold in there. I guess I have 2 questions. I guess first I'll do just like a scenario for you. So what if I volunteered to present next month? I'm just saying what if, and say I've got a presentation on like how to deploy a Python app via Flask to the web. And let's say I create a little sample app and I put it up on GitHub. And let's say my app uses like Python, and it uses Flask, and it uses Bootstrap, and it uses data tables. Those are kind of jobs for front end. I looked while we were talking, and they're all MIT licenses. And say I want to give my code away as an MIT license. In my license, do I have to call out the licenses of those 4 pieces that I use but don't modify, but I do indeed use them? They're part of the package that I make available on GitHub? Or do I just need to reference my own code?
So a lot of those licenses require you to give attribution and include the licenses most of the time. You have to look into the particulars, but I think MIT is pretty lenient. You may not have to say it's an MIT license, but I think they want you to make a copy of their license available. And so is that the answer to your question?
Well, no, I get that. Like I would typically have the MIT license, as part of in my repo. What I'm asking is, because I'm using 4 additional licenses, MIT licensed software like Bootstrap and Python for that matter, and Flask, which are all MIT licensed. In my own license or somewhere in my code, do I have to call them out by name, or is it okay for me just to include them in my project? And because I'm releasing mine under MIT, that I'm covered?
I believe those licenses do require attribution. So you may have to, at some point, like in a screen or something, say like, here's what I'm using.
Right, okay. And could I do that all under one license, like, license mine under MIT, and then just call out the dependencies?
Well, so usually what developers do is they list all the different licenses for different sections of their code, and then you have to worry about compatibility between the licenses. So there's some licenses, MIT is pretty compatible with everything, but there's some licenses that like butt heads with each other. They'll be like something where one license requires you to not have any patents, while others say like, okay, you can have a patent in here. So you have to make sure there's no conflict. Does that make sense?
Right, okay, yeah. And then Hobson asked in the chat, am I including the source? In the case of Python, no, I'm not. But in the case of like the JavaScript, I'm including the source insofar as it's needed to run, so.
Well, not every license requires you to include the source.
Right, okay. Okay, I'll be more cognizant. Just anecdotally, I don't see that done a lot. I see a lot of people like me, create a project, use a whole bunch of things, and then release it, as just like the one paragraph MIT license without calling everything out. I'm guilty of that as well, but
yeah,
bring up some good points that it might move us to be a little bit more cognizant of that. And then just if I could, just one more quick question. What we learned from here is that you can't take a GPL project and turn it into an MIT license, and that's what the issue was about. And that's not, you proved that wasn't the case, but we learned that you can't do that. But is the other way true, that you cannot take an MIT licensed product and make it a GPL if it's MIT?
No, I think that is permissible. You can go from in general, go from a more permissive license to a more restrictive license in the open source parlance. So you can even go from like a loosely permissive license to a more restrictive license, like where you have to open source it if it's network accessible kind of thing. Right.
Okay, but I can see where complications arise then if someone in that more less permissive, tries to stop someone else, they can go back and say, hey, but you took it, like in this very case here. You started from an MIT license yourself, so stop pointing fingers, right?
Right.
Yeah. Very good. Thank you for your time. I appreciate all the great information.
So I have a question. So what I learned, thank you for the talk. It was very informative. What I learned from the talk is licensing is confusing. Is there, if you're working on, say, an open source project, is there some organization you can turn to for like pro bono legal advice on something like this?
I'm not aware of any, sorry to say,
Okay.
but I would just try and hit up the community. There's definitely like, if you're a manager of a open source project, you can probably reach out to other open source projects, and I'm sure they've dealt with similar situations.
That's a good idea. Thank you.